Our main story tonight concerns judges, the only government workers whose official dress code is goth poncho. Judges rule on matters big and small, but they're also human beings, as we got reminded early in the pandemic when someone didn't mute their microphone during this remote Supreme Court hearing.
And what the FCC has said is that when the subject matter of the call ranges to the topic, then the call is transformed.
It's true, someone flushed a toilet during oral arguments, which, to be fair, isn't the most embarrassing Zoom mishap from back then. On a scale of 0 to Jeffrey Toobin, it probably falls somewhere in the middle. But I love that that lawyer just kept going. Who among us didn't sit on the toilet during work hours back then? You remember when I was in the void? I was on a toilet the whole time. I was dressed, I'm not a pervert, but I was on a toilet. What do you mean that's even more confusing? Don't worry about it, shut up. The Supreme Court's last term was, to put it mildly, eventful. They issued rulings on everything from gun rights to social media censorship to gerrymandering, and also kind of made the president a king, holding 6-3 in Trump versus the US, that presidents are completely immune from prosecution for things they did through core constitutional powers of the presidency, adding they're at least presumed to be immune and potentially are always immune for all official acts of their presidency, but leaving it open to interpretation as to what constitutes a core power and an official act, which is not ideal, because there are pretty obvious reasons why you'd want to be more precise there, as Sonia Sotomayor tried pointing out to Trump's lawyer.
If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
Holy shit! That is Trump's attorney arguing the president could be shielded from prosecution for assassinating a political rival. That is terrifying. Honestly, this is the oral argument that should have featured bathroom noises, as it seems they just flushed the rule of law down the fucking toilet. But extremity seems to be the standard now for this court, which has been aggressive in applying hardline conservative views to reverse established law. In 2022, they overturned Roe v. Wade. Last year, their decision on affirmative action reversed 45 years of legal precedent. And this June, they discarded the Chevron doctrine, which, as we'll get into later, is a critical 4-decade-old precedent concerning how regulatory agencies work. And all this fulfilled a promise that Trump repeatedly made on the campaign trail 8 years ago to try and get hesitant conservatives to support him.
We have to win, and one of the biggest reasons we have to do this for United States Supreme Court justices.
You got to go for Trump. Supreme Court justices.
And remember, justices of the Supreme Court. Remember that.
Supreme Court justices. That's all. That's all you have to think.
That turned out to be a pretty successful argument. If Trump had promised to throw paper towels at hurricane victims, or molest a flag, or decorate the White House for Christmas like it's an A24 horror movie, it might have been a less compelling message, though, to be fair, no less true. Because Trump delivered on that promise, and not just at the Supreme Court level. He's reshaped the judiciary from top to bottom in ways that are only starting to be felt. So given that, tonight, let's look at the federal courts, what Trump's done to them, and if elected again, what he could do next. And let's start with how our court system is actually structured. Generally speaking, lawsuits involving federal law start in one of 94 district courts around the country. There's at least one in every state, and this is where trials take place. If a case is appealed, it goes up to the courts of appeals. There are 13 of those, dividing the country into regional circuits. And if it's appealed from there, the Supreme Court could choose to hear it. There's some little stuff that I'm leaving out in there, including an extra layer at the bottom called Judge Steve Harvey gets a crack at it. But that is basically it. The Supreme Court hears around 100 cases a year, but the circuit courts beneath it handle around 40,000, with the district courts below them handling over 300,000 cases. So the decisions of those lower courts are in most cases final. And Trump was able to reshape a lot of them. There are around 900 active federal judges in total, and as president, he appointed 234 of them, rivaling the numbers of presidents who held office for twice as long as he did. And irritatingly, he tends to frame this as a stroke of tremendous luck.
You know, when I got in, we had over 100 federal judges that weren't appointed. Now, I don't know why Obama left that. It was like a big, beautiful present to all of us.
Yeah, But was it, though? Because the actual reason he got that big, beautiful president was because Senate Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell, stonewalled Obama's judicial nominees for years. Those vacancies weren't gifted so much as stolen, which is clearly different. Oprah's car giveaway wouldn't have seemed nearly as fun if she'd spent the previous night carjacking everyone in Chicago. And McConnell himself has admitted that once he had a president to his liking, filling court seats was his top priority.
If I have a choice between taking up a particular bill or taking up a circuit court judge, I take up a circuit court judge because I think it makes the longest lasting contribution to making this the kind of country it ought to be.
He's not lying there. During the Trump years, you couldn't whisper the words court vacancy anywhere in Congress without McConnell excitedly bursting through the wall like the fucking Kool-Aid man. And it wasn't just him. Right-wing groups have been focused on getting judges onto the bench for years now, with perhaps no one playing a larger role than this man, Leonard Leo. He's been called the man behind the Conservative effort to move the judiciary to the right. And one primary way that he's done this has been through his leadership at the Federalist Society, an organisation that he turned from a student club into an incubator and pipeline for Conservative lawyers to become public officials and judges. Leo's also a hugely successful fundraiser and has built a dark money network to funnel cash to Conservative causes, groups and politicians. And he's used a number of tactics over the years to conceal the movement of that money. In terms of where it ends up, he's recently been using what are called donor-advised funds, which make it practically impossible to trace where the money goes. And in terms of where it comes from, which does feel important, many entities he's been linked to haven't been required to disclose their donors. And as you'll see here, when asked about that, he can get cagey fast.
Could you describe to us what the purpose of the BH fund is?
BH Fund is a charitable organization. You can look it up, but I'm sure its statement of purpose is listed.
We did. And its tax document says its mission is to promote the rule of law and limited constitutional government. And it received $24 million from an anonymous donor in 2017.
I have a very simple rule, which is I'm engaged in the battle of ideas.
Yes.
And I care very deeply about our Constitution and the role of courts in our society. And I don't waste my time on stories that involve money and politics, because what I care about is ideas.
Oh, come on. I know this is so obvious it barely needs to be said, but where things come from does matter. For the same reason that Lunchables can't just list its ingredients as mind your fucking business. But even if it can be hard to say who all of Leo's backers are, it is clear what both he and they want. Judges on the bench who are against regulation and deeply socially conservative, although Leo will sometimes try and put a more moderate face on that. In the early days of Trump's term, Leo helped supply him with 25 names of potential Supreme Court nominees, and watch him shrug off questions about whether any of those names might one day impact the right to an abortion.
Is the fear on the left justified that this means that Roe v. Wade is in jeopardy if one of the 25 gets through the process?
The left has been using the Roe v. Wade scare tactic since 1982, when Sandra O'Connor was nominated. And over 30 years later, nothing's happened to Roe v. Wade. So I think the abortion issue is really very much a scare tactic.
As I think we all know, it played out a bit differently. Shortly afterward, Trump nominated Kavanaugh from Leo's list, and he, along with Gorsuch and Barrett, two other picks Leo recommended, wound up overturning Roe. So clearly, it wasn't just a scare tactic at all. It's honestly hard to imagine how that clip could have aged worse, other than if he continued, no one needs to prepare for any sort of novel coronavirus in the future. And don't worry about Armie Hammer's career, that thing's going to keep going great. The point is, Leo's had a huge amount of success in planting hard-right judges throughout the federal court system, and that has enabled conservative groups, some of which he funds, to effectively go judge shopping. What that means is they're able to write a lawsuit designed to achieve a specific policy end, bring it before a district court judge who came up through the Federalist Society, appeal it up through circuit courts, increasingly stocked with Federalist Society alumni, and maybe even get it in front of the Supreme Court, a full third of whose members came off a list from the Federalist Society's own Leonard fucking Leo. He's putting out new conservative judges the way Apple puts out new TV shows, constantly and basically silently. And while testing the law through the courts is something both Liberal and Conservative groups have long used as a tactic, it's now much easier for Conservatives to do it, even with incredibly weak cases. Take last year's fight over mifepristone, a drug used in most abortions. The lawsuit that precipitated that fight was clearly crafted to restrict abortion access. It began with activists creating a brand new group called the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which they incorporated in Amarillo, Texas, just months before it filed the lawsuit. And they chose Amarillo for a very specific reason.
By filing its lawsuit in Amarillo, the Alliance Defending Freedom was almost guaranteed to draw Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk, a Trump appointee who worked in the conservative Christian legal movement.
Exactly. By filing in Amarillo, they knew their case was likely to get assigned to Kacsmaryk, seen here shortly after asking his barber for the wet marine. That is the reason they and so many conservative groups are going to Amarillo. It's not for the historic tour of Route 66 or the canyon horseback ride or even the huge pair of legs, which are apparently number 30 on TripAdvisor's list of things to do in Amarillo, even though I've never seen a more obvious number 1 in my entire life. They have absolutely glowing reviews, such as, "It's a huge pair of legs standing in a pasture next to the road. What a unique statue, tall legs out in a field." And I figured while here, why not go find them? They're interesting and big. And amen to that, brother, they sure are. Kacsmaryk is incredibly conservative. He said being transgender is a delusion, has argued against contraception and same-sex marriage, and criticised the legal foundations of Roe v. Wade. So he was always likely to be incredibly sympathetic to the plaintiffs in the mifepristone case, which was lucky for them because their arguments were laughably weak. Basically, some of the plaintiffs were pro-life doctors who argued the FDA's approval of mifepristone, which has been used safely for over 20 years, should be withdrawn, in part because it could harm the doctors themselves. They argued that treating patients who'd suffered adverse health effects from the drug, which, again, rarely happens, could cause them hardship and subject them to enormous stress and pressure. There are a few things about that. First, none of those doctors were required to prescribe the drugs or regularly treat abortion patients. They couldn't identify a single case where any of them had been forced to provide such care, and there's already a federal law that protects them from having to do so. Basically, their argument did not have a leg to stand on, which is a little ironic, considering Amarillo has 2 of them that are just fucking hanging around for some reason. But Kacsmaryk sided with the plaintiffs anyway, striking down the FDA's approval of mifepristone. The government appealed his ruling, but it was then upheld by the notoriously conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where a third of the judges are Trump appointees. Now, the good news here is that the Supreme Court ultimately reversed the ruling, saying the plaintiffs lacked standing to sue because they hadn't convincingly proven that they were being harmed, because they fucking weren't. The bad news is this was by no means a full-throated rejection, as in Kavanaugh's drafting of the opinion, he explicitly left the door open to try again in the future, saying that it is not clear that no one else would have standing to challenge the FDA's relaxed regulation of mifepristone. A hint so broad, it might as well have had a winking emoji at the end of it. The point is, the courts are now incredibly amenable to lawsuits that Conservatives bring. And while the mifepristone and Trump immunity rulings have been pretty widely discussed, one of the biggest Conservative victories this year has actually flown under the radar a bit, even though, for most of Leonard Leo's big corporate backers, it's probably the most important reason to support him, and it concerns regulation. Companies famously hate regulation, an attitude shared by certain members of the Supreme Court, especially Neil Gorsuch, who always looks like the man in every Cialis commercial. Gorsuch released a book this year called Overruled: The Human Toll of Too Much Law, about how, in his view, regulatory agencies are out of control and basically making up new laws left and right. For years now, he's delivered a spiel about how federal agencies, which fall under the executive branch, have usurped the power that rightly belongs to the legislative one. It's an argument he delivers with his trademark electric personality like this.
The executive branch has made up so many new criminal laws that people have stopped counting at over 300,000. If your ketchup is too runny, you get in trouble for that because of a federal agency said so. I'm not making it up. What if you sell mattresses and you tear off that tag? You're probably a federal criminal. And if you import lobster in a plastic bag instead of a cardboard box, that's a problem because a bureaucrat says so. And Woodsy the Owl, Some of you, Woodsy the Owl, don't give a hoot, don't pollute. Remember him? Some of you remember him. Well, if you misuse his likeness, you might be a federal felon. Okay, that's what happens when you mix up the executive and the legislative power.
Okay, I know this is beside the point, but that was some deafening silence after he asked if anyone remembers Woodsy the Owl. Which does make sense. He's not exactly a top-tier owl anymore. Your current A-listers are probably Owl from Winnie the Pooh, Hedwig from Harry Potter, the Duolingo mascot, and, of course, this soggy little guy who went viral for looking like he's going through his third divorce. But while I'm sure Gorsuch worked hard to cherry-pick those regulations to dunk on, he's actually mischaracterising a lot of those rules in ways that feel pretty revealing. For instance, a few of the things he just cited as evidence of an out-of-control executive branch there actually came from the legislative one. The Woodsy the Owl thing was this law passed by Congress. As for his example about lobsters, that's him shorthanding a case involving the Lacey Act, which was, as its name might suggest, also an act of Congress. As for the others, those were all cases where Congress very clearly wanted specific things to be regulated. When it comes to ketchup, Congress passed this law directing the FDA to prevent mislabelling of foods, which the agency then did only after extensive review and public comment periods. Also, these kinds of regulations don't generally get enforced unless the violations are egregious. In one recent 10-year period, the FDA only managed to obtain 2 court injunctions against food products on account of misleading labelling. So it's not like prisons are filled with people who sold runny ketchup. If they were, you would know about it. Probably because we'd have already done a story called Ketchup Incarceration. That'd be 26 minutes long, featuring videos of 2 separate people crying and ending with Steve Buscemi dressed like a giant tomato for reasons that would make sense in context. And finally, when it comes to Gorsuch making fun of mattress tags, just so you know, Congress passed this law directing a federal agency to set flammability standards to ensure the safety of products like mattresses, including labelling them. And I know there is a certain hack comedy appeal to going, what's the deal with mattress tags? After all, why would you need a tag saying who made a mattress and when? When is that information ever really going to be useful to you, right?
A foam crib mattress by Storkcraft has been recalled for failing to meet federal standards for flammability. Affected mattresses were made between August 2014 and January 2015, and consumers should stop using the mattress and contact Storkcraft for a free barrier cover.
Oh, yeah, that does make a lot more sense now. Among other things, those mattress tags might help you figure out if your mattress has been recalled. So I guess the answer to Gorsuch's question, why is the government issuing rules about mattress tags, is so a baby's crib doesn't turn into a miniature Wicker Man, you fucking idiots! And look, I got plenty of issues with regulations, but it is disingenuous to suggest they're all being issued arbitrarily at random, when on the whole, they're being carefully crafted by career experts to keep us safe. And that work is now going to be significantly harder due to the case that I mentioned at the start of this story, the one overturning what's known as Chevron deference. We discussed Chevron a bit in our first show of this year, but it's a long-standing legal doctrine arising from this 1984 Supreme Court ruling. Very basically, Chevron said that when there is a lawsuit over regulation, judges should give a lot of leeway to agencies. So let's say Congress writes a law saying, I want mercury out of drinking water. Under Chevron, the EPA would decide how to do exactly that, and then their decisions would be hard to overturn. Chevron is one of the most cited precedents in American law. It's mentioned in more than 18,000 federal court decisions and was the deciding factor in approximately 70 Supreme Court decisions. It's essentially one of the foundations current American law has been built on. Getting rid of Chevron isn't just removing the bottom Jenga block, it's removing the entire table underneath it. And companies have, unsurprisingly, long wanted Chevron gone. And in June, they got their wish, thanks to a ruling in a couple of cases that were consolidated into one called Loper Bright versus Raimondo. And frustratingly, like the Mifepristone case, it's built on quite a bit of bullshit. On its face, it involves a group of fishermen trying to overturn a regulation requiring them to pay for federal monitors to prevent overfishing. They complained it could have made it impossible for them to make a living. And I say could have, because the regulation was not being enforced. And even if it had been, the fishermen didn't identify a single fishing trip for which they would have been required to pay for monitoring services under that rule. Nevertheless, the fishermen were represented by these 2 conservative groups, one of which, this one, is backed by entities linked to, you'll never guess it, Leonard fucking Leo. At this point, finding out Leonard Leo had a role in a major Conservative court case is like finding out a ventriloquist dummy has a hand up its arse. It's basically assumed. And I do think it's telling that some major industries suddenly seem very interested in the outcome of this obscure phishing case, with dozens writing amicus briefs, including the US Chamber of Commerce, the North American Meat Institute, and a trade organisation representing e-cigarette companies. And unless fish are vaping now, I don't really see why that group should be involved, although if they are, that is also cool as hell, because look at that. That is fucking sick. I don't mean to be pro-tobacco, but that's pure sex appeal right there. And those interests got their way, because the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 to overturn Chevron deference entirely, making it much easier for companies to challenge a regulatory agency's decision in the future. And when you put that in tandem with all these other recent rulings, the power of regulatory agencies has now been sharply limited. And Conservatives are understandably very, very happy about all of this. Here's Jim Jordan explaining why.
The fundamental question is who decides? The, quote, experts, the technocracy, as Mr. Bishop described, or the elected officials. I may not know, we may not know how many parts per billion is necessary to... We may not know that, but I do know one thing. Regulations and rules that impact the economy to the tune of millions and millions of dollars and impact the 800,000 folks I get to represent, that's important. We have deferred to the, quote, experts. The experts who think they can run our lives and never be held accountable.
Look, I'll give him this. When Jim Jordan says, I may not know how many parts per billion is necessary, he is absolutely right. After all, he's a man who prides himself on not knowing things, whether it's science, technology, or indeed the alleged sexual abuse happening to college wrestlers on a team he coached. Jim Jordan has built a personal brand on not knowing what's going on. But there are a few problems with his reasoning there. First, Congress can't pass shit right now. But even if it was functional, you wouldn't necessarily want it writing technical rules on everything. Legislators can be good at many things: delivering speeches, raising campaign money, getting uncontrollably horny during Beetlejuice the musical, escaping to Mexico when their constituents need them the most. But they don't possess universal expertise in technology, medicine, or food safety. The point is, every part of a regulator's job is now going to be much harder. As one commentator wrote, Loper Bright has opened the door so that the worst judges will issue nationwide injunctions, effectively one-man vetoes of entire agencies in real time based on personal opinion, which is just fully not how the government is supposed to work. There's a reason that Schoolhouse Rock video doesn't end with some random judge in Mississippi suddenly wiping his arse with that bill. And unfortunately, it's already begun. One analysis found that Loper Bright's already been cited in 116 cases since the Supreme Court decision. In fact, less than a week after it was issued, 3 judges in different states published decisions on the same day citing Loper Bright as they blocked implementation of a new rule that would prohibit discrimination in healthcare based on gender identity. And at the same time, judges are making it clear they're not much better equipped than Congress to answer highly technical questions. In one decision this term, Neil Gorsuch repeatedly confused nitrous oxide, often known as laughing gas, with nitrogen oxides, the class of compounds that help form smog. That's a mistake you get to make at dental school exactly once. And when you take all this together, you can understand why one of the justices on the losing end of all these recent 6-3 decisions has been going around saying stuff like this.
There are days that I've come to my office after an announcement of a case and closed my door and cried. There have been those days, and there are likely to be more.
Well, that doesn't feel great. You know things are bad when Supreme Court justices are crying alone in their office, instead of where they usually cry on national TV while getting credibly accused of sexual assault. So what can we do? Well, members of Congress have introduced bills to try and undo some of these decisions. But given that Republicans currently control the House, those bills have gone nowhere. And that actually brings us to the key point here. Because the only way of undoing some of the harm that's been done and preventing even more happening is by keeping Trump out of the White House and Republicans out of Congress in November. Because, like in 2016, Trump's intentions here are very clear. The oldest justices are currently Thomas and Alito, and many believe one or both of them could step down due to age in the next 4 years, potentially giving Trump the chance to cement the court's conservative supermajority for a generation. He's openly promising his base as much.
I will once again appoint rock-solid conservative judges in the mold of Justices Antonin Scalia, Samuel Alito, who's done a fantastic job, and the great Clarence Thomas, he's been fantastic.
First, no, he has not been fantastic. He's been a fucking nightmare. Eagle-eyed viewers will remember that I nearly obliterated my personal finances to encourage him to retire, which honestly would have been worth it, but would have also put me in such a hole I'd have probably had to go full cancel culture warrior to dig myself out of it. I'd have a 2-hour Netflix stand-up special called They Won't Let Me Do Stand-Up Anymore, and a stadium tour called They Won't Let Me Tour either. The point is, that is a man who knows that that is the promise that can get him elected and have people willing to ignore literally everything else about him. Look, the remaking of America's judiciary is the culmination of a plan that's been going on for decades. And while a lot of the judges that have been put in place aren't going anywhere for a while, that doesn't mean the change has to be permanent. And securing the White House and Congress is our best shot at starting to slowly undo that change. And I know it can feel extremely depressing. I mean, sad owl-level depressing. To live in a world where rich, anonymous interests can install friendly judges to hand them whatever rulings they want, and where the government's ability to keep us safe is hamstrung by some dork's B- stand-up routine. But that situation only persists if we let it. If we can elect people who value an independent judiciary and the rule of law, then Leo and his backers won't be able to so easily buy the justice system, meaning he'll probably need something else to spend all of that money on. And may I suggest a trip to the most spectacular legs in Texas? I don't want to oversell them, but I hear they're both interesting and big.